Hello, everyone, and welcome in this Meet the Researcher series. My name is Dimitris Bouris, and I'm a Monnet chair on the USA Global Actor. The chair is called ATHENA, and the name is inspired by the Greek goddess of war and wisdom. And the rationale of the chair was to look at the multiple security crises which have led to increased attention to the EU's role as a global actor. How can the EU become a more effective global actor and also contribute to international peace and security? And this is what we're trying to do with this chair. The chair holder, but also Dr. Olga Buliuk, our senior researchers in the chair. This event, it's the first of its kind. It's part of the chair, and it's the Meet the Researcher event. And the idea of these recordings and these talks are for students to have the opportunity to get insights from colleagues, well-established colleagues, researching different aspects of the EU's role as a global actor, on how they conduct their research, what approaches they use, what case studies they use, and what questions guide their own research. The idea is that these events can inspire students to think and reflect on their own positionality as well as research methods, and also give to the students the opportunity to meet people behind their articles and behind their written work. And I'm super happy to welcome today Nora Onar, who is an associate professor of international studies at the University of San Francisco, and also an academic director of the graduate program in international studies. Nora's research interests include the theory and practice of international relations, social theory, foreign policy analysis, comparative area studies, political ideologies, gender, as well as history and memory. And we will be talking about all of them a little bit. Nora received her doctorate from Oxford University, and she also holds a master's and undergraduate degrees from Johns Hopkins University and Georgetown University, respectively. She speaks 5 languages. She has traveled to over 80 countries, and she has lived in 8 of them. She's the author of a number of academic works, but she has a forthcoming book entitled Contesting Pluralisms, Islam, Liberalism, and Nationalism in Turkey with Cambridge University Press. And she's the lead editor of the volume Istanbul, Living with Difference in a Global City. She has written extensively on different topics, and I'm planning to touch upon some of them. And what I would like to do with Nora is to take her back to her PhD years from the beginning and kind of see how her academic career evolved. Nora, thank you so much for your willingness to do this and for being with us in this classroom at the University of Amsterdam virtually, and for waking up so early in the morning to be with us. We appreciate it a lot. And I guess the first question is if you can tell us a little bit more about your background, what made you decide to pursue a PhD, and what was the topic of your PhD, and what kind of methods and approaches you used?
Sure, happy to do so. With some preliminary apologies that I live very near an airport. So every now and then a plane will pass. I don't know if it will pick up the volume, but sometimes it does affect the internet interface. So if I go wobbly for a second, it should usually pass after the plane passes. Yes, no, thank you so much for this very kind invitation and introduction. And I'm delighted to have an opportunity to engage with your graduate students. We also have I also have my cohort of graduate students who are in a similar stage of their processes right now. So I can very much empathize with both teacher and students, across this vast geography that separates us. But I'm very delighted to be able to share ideas nonetheless. Yeah, I remember being kind of back in that stage as an early career researcher, knowing that I wanted to be a academic, in part because I think it depends on the policy field. But in my case, I had been trained at undergraduate and master's institutions that were quite policy oriented. And so there was always kind of a choice or fork in the road I thought I would come to, where I had to decide if I wanted to go the kind of the diplomacy, foreign policy kind of practitioner route, or to go the scholarly route. And at the time that I was, making this sort of a decision, this was in the early 2000s. So it was in the context of the build up to the Gulf Wars immediately after 9/11. And I realized in that context that I would always feel a need to speak truth to power. And that would be difficult to do. That's a famous saying from the Edward Said, the post-colonial theorist, Palestinian American scholar. And he kind of envisages the role of the intellectual and the role of the academic as someone who has a privileged positionality, vis-a-vis the audiences that we're able to address and the tools that we're able to mobilize, but that we should use this privilege towards transformative projects. So I had a normative, convictions that were not being reflected in the policy terms that I was observing around me in the United States and the EU to a certain extent as well. And so I opted to go the academic route. And in that case, I chose to go to the University of Oxford for a combination of personal reasons. And I think that animates everybody's decision, right? It's where you, who you want to be with at that time in life, who you, how swiftly or how much in terms of financing, how much, material support you can get for your project. So there's many practical factors that play into the, decisions that end up having very path-dependent consequences on your intellectual and professional development. So for a variety of kind of personal, professional, and ideological reasons, I ended up at Oxford, which I loved, but I was also a little bit of a sort of oddball in my cohort, because I was coming from the perspective of someone who has a very organic connection with Turkey. I've spent many, many years there. My family is from Turkey, and part of my family is from Turkey, and so I always felt that I was participating in conversations as a little bit of an insider and a little bit of an outsider. This was the time of the debates in the EU about, is Turkey European or not, and so I wanted, and I also had in many parts of the world that were beyond the transatlantic space. There's very often the focus of conversations about EU or foreign policy, or just foreign policy in general. So I was born in Iran. I grew up in China and Japan. And so I always had a perspective that was kind of from the outside. Euro experiences and interests and convictions and things I'd seen with my own eyes didn't necessarily match up with the conceptual frameworks and the sort of empirical conversations I was hearing people having in discussions about Turkey and sort of more broadly. And one of the advantages, disadvantages of the British system is that you read a lot, and it's a lot of self-guided reading. And so it was in this context that I discovered kind of the post-colonial, decolonial literature. I use the word post-colonial just because I come from a sort of Middle Eastern genealogy of how one does this sort of critical work, but I very much embrace the work of explicitly decolonial scholars who are often coming from Latin American or indigenous perspectives. So it's slightly different positionalities at play, but it's this sort of the same broader episteme confronting both historical colonialism and traces of coloniality, logics of coloniality that persist in the way we read and act in the world. And so, yeah, so I came up with a PhD dissertation, or a DPhil dissertation topic that reflected my own interest at the time. And here, so it's just some advice as you're planning, since you're in the framing stages of your project, pick something that you love and that you're passionate about, because otherwise it's torture sit by yourself for many, many hours a day alone. You know, I think introverts do a little bit better in sort of thesis writing processes probably than extroverts, but everybody can do it, but you have to care about the topic or it will be torture. And I will say there was a certain substrand of the literature on EU integration that I was not particularly fond of. And when I needed to go to sleep, I would read that literature in order to help me sleep. But you don't write a dissertation on the basis of things that bore you to pieces, right? So I wrote about, I tried to place my passions in a more kind of strategic context in a way that spoke to the broader zeitgeist and sort of the big questions related to my passions of that time. So, you know, a lot of people in this period were writing PhDs about, or master's dissertations about Turkey, you know, Turkey's Europeanization process. And now 20 years hindsight, this seems like a very, you know, it was a very niche topic that became, you know, the lost salience relatively soon, and they had to reinvent their projects and their framing. So but my work, I framed it as how have people in Turkey as a case of a quote unquote non-Western, they perceived to be non-Western entity engaged with the claims of European universalism, the claims of European actors historically and today to have generated political, economic, and social practices that, you know, are attributed with universal relevance, and how historically have people in quote unquote, and again, I think these are, because I think these are constructions, quote unquote non-Western context responded to that universalistic challenge. And so in this context, I was kind of lucky because I was able to pivot the project and kind of tweak the project as the conversation about Turkey's role in Europe evolved over the years. So try and find projects that that speak to your passions, but you're also kind of reading the room in terms of the zeitgeist and what people are, you know, gets people's hearts beating more broadly, not just you, but also try and frame it in a way that allows you room to grow as the conversations you care about evolve.
Thank you, Nora. And I mean, this takes me to the next question about Turkey, because you have written extensively on issues pertaining to history and to Turkey's foreign policy. Could you tell us a little bit more about this kind of research, and also, you know, what kind of methods you have used for this kind of research?
Right, and so the methods question is a key one, right? And also the choice of kind of case or kind of, you know, empirical space in which you're going to focus. And again, this may be dictated by a combination of, you know, your experiences and your own positionality. You know, so although I was a PhD student in Oxford, I was living in Turkey for most of the time that I was there, and I had this policy, you know, background and also a professional background prior to doing my PhD working in civil society. And here I would urge you, anything you find really interested in the applied space, think about what it is a case of. So Turkish foreign policy, yes, interesting. You know, history and memory, the role of how history is appropriated in foreign policies today, interesting. So I started to write, for example, about neo-Ottomanism in Turkish foreign policy. And this is, this is interesting, but what is it a case of? It's a case of a country with revisionist impulses, thinking about the role of its history and trying to reinvent its agency through claims to authenticity to the new world. Is Turkey the only country that does this? No. And so I started to think of Turkey as a case of a revisionist former empire. And that allowed me to then expand the analysis to encompass other revisionist former empires, such as Iran or Russia or China. And this, you know, opens your audience wider, right? So so I think, you know, whatever your space is, there's going to be kind of a really thick, really rich conversation, and that's wonderful, about our context and our cases as cases of something, and then that can help us to sort of broker broader comparisons. I'm not one who advocates for sort of very broad statistically based generalizations. I think multi-method research is valuable and quantitative research is valuable, but I very much believe that we should respect context. And so this is why my own personal orientation is qualitative and most multi-method. But it is really useful to think in terms of from the specific to the broader. How is the question that you're engaging with in and of itself, but as a case of something, as a for what it tells us about the bigger picture. And Turkish foreign policy was a way to do that, basically.
And after that, I mean, you wrote a lot on Turkish foreign policy, and you also published a lot on topics related to Europe, womanhood, and Islam as well. What made you start looking to the EU?
So yeah, it was again being, in terms of my own positionality, being in a space whose Europeanness was highly contested, and two of the sort of vectors or the spaces within which these contests were taking place had to do with the role of gender and the role of religiosity and the way that sort of received wisdoms about the way these were playing out in Turkey as a Muslim majority country and a Muslim majority candidate to the EU. So again, not Turkey just as Turkey, but Turkey as a case of something. And so, for various reasons, I do consider myself to be an intersectional sort of post-colonial feminist. And so these are ways that, these are questions that I wanted to foreground in my work. Oftentimes gender is treated as something separate, but actually everything we do is gendered, right? And so, I wanted to, that's salient in the work that I was in any case doing, not just as a sort of normative project, but also I think analytically, it is really helpful. I just had the privilege of writing the afterword for a special forthcoming special issue of European Security on critical feminist and post-colonial perspectives on EU security. And in that context, really the sort of the analytical traction you get from taking a gendered perspective is phenomenal. It's to read Putin or Erdogan or EU technocrats or Borrell or Trump without a gendered lens is to really miss a big part of the story of why they do. It's causal. Why they do what they do is constitutive, and it has impactful. The role of gender frames and how they're used to rationalize various policies, including things like invasion, are palpable. So I wanted to kind of mainstream, as it were, the insights of gender studies in the broader work that I was doing.
Thank you, Nora. I want to bring you a little bit more recently, although it's still 10 years ago. In 2013, you co-wrote this article with Calypso Nicolaides on the decentric agenda, Europe as a post-colonial power, which was published in Cooperation and Conflict. What inspired you to look at the decentric and post-colonial perspectives?
So that was something that I wrote at I was kind of wrapping up my doctoral dissertation, which had been, on sort of Ottoman and Turkish encounters with European universalism. And as I said, in that context, I had really done a deep dive into the post-colonial literature and sort of critiques of European universalism. And so this was something that I really wanted to write. And it's always a good idea for those of you who are, kind of embarking on doctoral sort of careers. It's always a good idea to, author something with your supervisor, if possible, with your advisor, because, you have this organic kind of co-constitutive creative relationship anyway in terms of your intellectual production. And it's very important to choose a doctoral advisor who not everybody has that luxury, but I was very fortunate to find someone with whom we really connected. And so I proposed this article, special issue that she was co-editing with Richard Whitman for Cooperation and Conflict on normative power Europe 10 years later. And now it's been 10 years since we tried to decenter normative power Europe coming from a post-colonial theme. So it was, and it's proved to be a very generative kind of frame because, there was no conversations like this really happening in sort of EU studies at the intersection of EU and IR around that time. And so we used the frame of decentering because while we explicitly flag the post-colonial in the title and in the literature, decentering is a way to kind of get it decolonial while also encompassing countries that were not properly colonized, like Turkey, Iran, Russia, and China. So it opens up the sort of the spaces and the communities, the political communities that you can analyze in more expansive ways. Also, Eastern Europe, is a place that is experiences many kind of the hierarchical logics associated with European universalism and colonialism, but of course was never formally colonized as well. So this decentering frame is more analytical descriptive. But yes, we explicitly flagged the sort of post-colonial inspiration for it. And that's just something that you'll also discover as you grow as you grow your career, is that sometimes you just click with people. And I've been fortunate to have many wonderful co-authors besides Calypso as well, who when you click, it's much more fun to write together than it is to you know how the temptation of procrastination, right? In academia, and the temptation to layer on, there's so many interesting things and you think you can do it all, and there's only 24 hours in a day. So having a co-author who keeps you on track is a wonderful experience. And I've been fortunate in that regard. Our latest piece, I don't know if, I think I sent Dimitri a copy of it, our latest piece for a textbook chapter, actually. So that was very exciting that we made it into a textbook on theoretical approaches to European foreign policy. So hopefully it can reach more students, wondering about where to situate their passions and their work.
Talking about this, could you shed a little bit more light on the differences between or among decentering, decolonial, and post-colonial perspectives? Because sometimes, especially for students, it's a little bit difficult to understand which are the main differences among these approaches and concepts.
Okay, yeah, so I mean, I think they all come, I like to say that they all come from so there's a lot of terms, right? Decentering, decolonial, post-colonial, anti-colonial, and sometimes used interchangeably, but then sometimes, people frame them as being somehow opposed to each other. So it can be definitely kind of word soupy. And I think the way to, decentering is an analytical descriptive term, right? The way we do decentering is explicitly post-colonial, but there's potentially other ways to decenter, and other kind of theoretical traditions via which one can decenter. And maybe the advantages of that are that, again, you can examine a wider range, or not necessarily recently, have not necessarily been colonized, or who you can also look at, for example, decentering sort of patriarchal or kind of heteronormative assumptions. It's not only colonial logics that can be decentered, there's other logics that can be decentered. And then post-colonial, decolonial, I think they're more or less the same project. They have different genealogies. Post-colonial, not different, but they're just geographically, it was kind of in multiple spaces. There was frustration in the Middle East and North Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in African-American context, in Afro-Caribbean context, in indigenous context around the world, specifically in Latin America and Oceania, in South Asia, in India, and in East Asia, all of these terms, even East Asia, South Asia, these are legacies of colonialism, right? So in all of these different places where people have been impacted by European universalizing frames and their hierarchies, there's been critique that have emerged over the past 100, 150 years. And during the sort of the Cold War era, and these became more cogently, articulated by a number of sort of seminal scholars that have studied in the Middle Eastern context, people like Gayatri Spivak in South Asian context, Dipesh Chakrabarti writing a little bit later, people like Walter Mignolo in or Bonaventure de Souza in Latin American context, many others. I'm not doing it all justice to the many different people operating in these spaces, but they all basically it's an epistemic project of trying to render visible the hierarchies, the racialized hierarchies for post-colonial, decolonial feminists, the gendered hierarchies that animate, the way we think and do things. So I don't think in spirit there's that much difference actually, but there's just a different, slightly different genealogy. So maybe arguably places that are geographically closer to the EU are more, there's a tendency to use the term post-colonial more. Places where there's greater distance and especially in indigenous context, I think the word decolonial to me has strong associations with indigenous activism. And in fact, the best methodology textbook, if you want to really sort of explicitly decolonial approach, please check out the wonderful, wonderful work of Linda Tuiwai-Smith. She's a Maori activist scholar who I think is as formidable as any Edward Said or Frantz Fanon, or she's remarkable in both her deconstruction, but also her articulation of the dangers of academic extractivism, even amongst good, well-intentioned critical scholars. So there are inflections and nuances, but overall, I think it's part of the broader, same type of critical project coming at it from different angles.
Thank you. I want to take you to your latest article, which was co-written with Sarah Wolf, David Gassi, and Daniela Huber, and published in the Journal of Common Market Studies a couple of months ago, if I'm not mistaken. And for that article, you use contrapuntal negotiation of dissonant perspectives on common governance challenges at the micro, meso, and macro scales. Could you please elaborate a little bit more on this kind of methodology, but also on how it can be operationalized?
Yeah, we are so excited about this piece and talk about kind of fruitful co-authorship. As I said, sometimes you just, as it is with friends, right? Sometimes you just click. And for whatever reason, we had Sarah Wolf was convening a workshop or decentering EU foreign policy. In that context, invited me to participate, and I couldn't actually come, but we remained in touch about it. And it turned out, anyway, for whatever reason, we coalesced into a core group that wrote this article over the course of the pandemic, shared Google Docs, late night for me or early morning for them. And it culminated in a piece where we take the Saidian, Edward Said, again, this genealogy that is very important to my thinking, the Saidian argument about contrapuntality, which is actually that's from the study of music. And I'm tone deaf. You would never want to hear me sing a song anywhere. It would probably make dogs cry to hear me sing. But I very much appreciate the idea that you don't need to seek harmony. You don't need to seek perfect overlap in perspectives on normative perspectives in terms of the way we analyze, a given problem out there. So any topic from, that concerns us, right? Climate change, sort of the precarity of, sort of refugees and migrants, nuclear weapons proliferation, whatever the topic may be, there's always going to be, we don't need to seek unity and totality and harmony in the voices and the perspectives on it. In fact, we learn from the counterpoint, we learn from the dissonance. And this is something I experienced very viscerally in a seminar I convened during the pandemic on interdisciplinary perspectives on a post-Western world. This is where I was coming to write in the paper, or read an article, that I found that whenever I engaged with a controversial topic and there was tension in our conversations in the classroom or with our guest speakers, if you listen with an open heart, you can, you learn from the counterpoint, you learn from the dissonance. And those are those are when we have the breakthroughs, right? So it can be a little bit anxiety creating for if you're conflict averse, but our argument was that in key policy spaces, so we theorized the idea of contrapuntality being not just looking out for one counterpoint, but let's listen to a multiplicity of voices at the same time. This isn't cacophony, this is plurality, and you can hear multiple threads and stories at the same time. So like climate change, right? you can't talk about climate change unless you take a holistic perspective. You can't try to address climate change unless you recognize that there are, very poor people in vulnerable positions who are going to be impacted in ways that are differentiated from, the EU High Commissioner who's developing a strategy on this topic, and differently impacted than the NGOs who are active in the space, and differently impacted than the national governments that are active in the space. Everybody has their agenda. Everybody has their lived experiences. Everybody has their fears. So rather than saying one way is right and one way is wrong, or have one voice try to dominate, listen to the counterpoints. And we propose to organize how to listen to those counterpoints at the sort of the micro level of kind of interhuman connections, or in sort of the very, very sort of local contextualized context. When it comes to refugees, listen to what refugees say. We also need to listen to what the political scientist says, and the minister who's responsible for the budget of implementing the policy says. And so the idea is how to listen contrapuntally. In this particular piece, we kind of apply it in a sort of a pilot way to the fields of religious governance, migration governance, and European neighborhood governance, specifically vis-a-vis Ukraine. But in moving forward, we're actually going to kind of develop and see how this can be parlayed as a practical method of pluralizing the way we think about and practice international relations. So we're going to do interviews with people who are involved in gender based issues at the elite official level, at the civil society level, and at the level of global activists, especially activists from the global south. We're going to try and apply them. How do we listen contrapuntally and try and mediate a conversation kind of as translators? The theorist doesn't come from an objective point of nowhere. We're translators. So how can we empathetically tease out the connections between different stories towards both kind of conceptual advancement and ideally also applied practices that are more pluralistic and more effective.
This sounds super interesting, and I'm really looking forward to seeing this project coming into fruition, I guess, in a couple of years, because this is how long it takes us to have projects into fruition. Last question from my side, Nora. I mean, you already gave us a hint on this, but which are your research plans for the short and a little bit maybe longer term? You mentioned this kind of research which you will initiate. Is there something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a number of projects. So doing some work with you on sort of critical approaches to European Union foreign policy that try to center and honor a plurality of voices that are often marginalized in these conversations. And so I have several projects that are along these lines. Again, there's this special issue, forthcoming special issue of European security that explicitly takes a feminist and post-colonial perspective and reveals, I think, remarkable insights. I highly encourage you to read the articles that contributed to that special issue when it comes out. I think for me, more broadly, I continue to do this work in terms of the legacies of empire and how, the purpose of decentering Europe is not to sort of recenter Europe by, exceptionalizing its sort of hegemonic tendencies. It's to push tendencies everywhere, and in an increasingly multipolar context, we're also seeing hegemonic tendencies, transpiring in these other revisionist former empires I've mentioned, right? So Turkey, Iran, Russia, and China. So I have several forthcoming pieces that are seeking to, some are more normative in thrust. So we have a special issue on, just came out with Global Studies Quarterly it's called From Transatlantic Order, Reimagining International Relations is Interlocking Regional Worlds. And here I co-authored with Emilian Kowalski, and we have a wonderful lineup of contributions that basically try to understand the historical and sociological sources of how multipolarity looks from Chinese perspective, Japanese perspective, Indian perspective, Iranian perspective, from perspective of Chinese African relations, and so that is neither, you know, apologetics for, we're not romanticizing the rise of new centers of gravity, but nor are we a priori sort of securitizing it. We're trying to understand meaningfully what it looks like from other positionalities, right? From other standpoints besides Brussels or Washington. And so that's a project I'm really excited about. That was just published. I can send the link. Maybe Dimitris, you can share it out. I'm very excited about that one. And I think I will keep evolving in that direction. So since I no longer am based in Turkey, Turkey continues to be a major source of inspiration in terms of how you know, how and why to think critically. Certainly the recent tragic events in Turkey really underscore the importance of listening to not just centers and capital cities, but, you know, people who are the most marginalized and vulnerable within a given national or supranational context. And so Turkey will always be an inspiration, but more broadly, I'm working towards an eventual book on non-Western perspectives on quote unquote multipolarity.
Great, Nora. Thank you. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us. Thank you so much for waking up so early to be with us.
Now we have a beautiful day here in California.
I mean, it's getting, you know, I see the daylight for you, and for us it's getting dark. But really appreciate, and I know how busy you are, because I follow, you know, all the work you are doing. So we really appreciate it a lot that you made the time to be with us. And I hope, and I'm sure that, you know, this talk and this conversation also inspired some of the people here further. And also that it will also inspire more people out there when they will be seeing this recording. Thanks a lot once again, and also a big thanks to Louis and to Daci for helping with the technicalities of this webinar, and to the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, and also last but not least to the European Commission for co-funding this Monnet. I'm looking forward to seeing you soon in person as well. I guess the earliest in July in Amsterdam. Take care, and once again, thank you for your contribution and for being with us.
Thank you, Dimitris, for this lovely invitation, and it was a pleasure to engage.
See you.